Hi, everybody who have joined us tonight. Thanks for coming out, or actually not coming out. That's an old habit. Thanks for signing in for our conversation with Daley and Sam Wang about Dave's new book, Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. Here's his book. My name is Dorothea von Moltke. I'm one of the owners of Labyrinth Books. And we have several co-sponsors tonight whom I want to start by thanking. First of all, the Princeton Public Library. The vast majority of Labyrinth and the library's online events, author events, are co-hosted, which continues the close relationship, close partnership that we have during more normal times. And I encourage you to follow the store or the library or both of us on Facebook, or to sign up for our newsletters on our respective websites. The idea for this event tonight comes from Sam Wang and the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, which he directs. I am grateful to him for this and also for joining tonight and being in conversation with Dave Daley. And finally, the Woodrow Wilson School is our other sponsor. Many thanks to everyone there who helped us to get word out. I have a few practical things quickly before I introduce our guests. And then hand things over to Sam. I want to be sure that you know that you can get a copy of Unrigged for 10% off. The best options for ordering a copy are either to order it over the phones during our phone hours, the information is in the chat, or to send an email to orders.labyrinth@gmail.com. Those are the options if you want to do a curbside pickup. You can always order online and have your book mailed to you. The shipping there, unfortunately, is only free in New Jersey. So you might want to call us or email us. And the ordering information, of course, is also on our websites. So the sound you're hearing is my cat wanting to get out of this room, which I will let her out shortly, but not right this second. I'm going to take the chat down during the conversation, and then I'll put it back up during the Q&A. So just quickly, here is how to ask a question in this particular platform. There's a button on the bottom in the middle, you'll see. It says Ask a Question. And rather than putting the questions in the chat, just go there and queue up anything that comes to mind during the conversation between Dave and Sam. And if you see something there that interests you as well, there's a little arrow next to all questions where you can upvote something. And then we will see that and can try to give some priority to those questions when we get to the Q&A. And we'll make sure to leave time for that. But now a few words about our speakers. Several years ago, David Daley and Sam Wang were actually at Labyrinth to talk about Dave's previous book with the blunt title, Rat Fucked, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count. That book has been hugely influential in shining a light on the partisan manipulations of our electoral map and in making gerrymandering a word and a practice that are now broadly understood by many in a way that they just weren't before. And Dave's book was essential to that happening. Dave was editor-in-chief at Salon.com before joining Fair Vote, where he is now senior fellow. Many of you will know that Sam Wang is a neuroscientist in the Department of Molecular Biology and Neuroscience at Princeton. He is here tonight, however, and this too, I think many of you know, in his capacity as founder and director of both the Princeton Gerrymandering Project and the Princeton Election Consortium. And clearly we couldn't have hoped for a better interlocutor, so that's really an honor. Just a couple quick thoughts about the book we're here to discuss. It remains so remarkable to me that it would have been very different to be talking about David's book Unrigged a month ago than it is now. So much seems to have happened. The feeling of helplessness that has accompanied the pandemic and of severe worry, I think, about the state of democracy as we head towards the November elections seemed for many, and certainly for me, at times immovable. And I'm not quite sure how we would have engaged with Dave's very hopeful book about what ordinary citizens can do to fight back against a system that's increasingly rigged and also increasingly backed by the judiciary in the shape that it's in. And then came George Floyd's murder, which marked the beginning of a new moment of Americans battling back to save democracy, as the subtitle of Dave's book has it. And since there's no such thing as democracy, as long as there is structural racism, it just seems possible right now that enough people are beginning to understand and act on this. And so there's a different tide, it feels like, and it suddenly feels like Dave's book is synced up to something that is happening. And I hope we can talk a little bit about that. Unrigged is about voting rights. So it's not, in that sense, directly about race, but it is also crucially about race, since efforts to disenfranchise voters, of course, disproportionately target minority voters. The book is a tribute to those who between 2016 and 2018 got to work to fix a broken system. And it's also a painful reminder of how high the odds are stacked against lasting fixes. And therefore, it's a call to all of us to get to work and to keep at it. I'm really glad that we have Dave here to talk to us about the kinds of things that can be done. So with that, let me bring him and Sam up and take myself out of the picture. I'm just going to do that quickly. Here comes Dave. Hi, Dave.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for that. That's beautiful.
And here comes Sam. Hi, Sam. All right. And I will return later during the Q&A. So take it away.
All right, Dave, welcome back to Princeton.
Hey, Sam. It's good to be back in Princeton.
Good to see you. Thanks. We have a much larger audience than last time, because last time we fit into Labyrinth Books. This time we've gone virtual, and I see 176 people down in the chat. So, that's pretty good turnout, right? Beautiful night out.
Exciting. Thank you all for coming, everybody.
It's lovely out, and here we are. Thanks everyone for staying in tonight. That's the COVID version of thanking people for coming out. Hey, let's leap right into it. Dorothea has already done a good job of introducing you, but I just have to say some more wonderful things about you. I have to say, when I work on democracy issues, I do a lot of it here in Princeton, in my office, at my desk, with my team at the Gerrymandering Project. But, Dave, you are a real reporter, right? You've worked at the Hartford Courant, you worked at Salon, you've traveled around the country. You've got a whole thing in this. I just have to show. Here's the book again for everybody. Unrigged. Yep, there it is. Right. And in this book, you can see when you read it, Dave talks about traveling all over the country, riding around in somebody's beater of a car, having, I don't know, didn't you have like lunch with George Will or something like that? Like there's like all kinds of adventures in there. And so you've really done a lot of like real shoe leather reporting. And Dorothea has not even mentioned things that you've done. I've referred to you as the Hunter S. Thompson of democracy reform, where you get out there, you talk with people, you talk to anyone about anything. I don't know. There you are. That's you.
Hunter S. Thompson of gerrymandering. I kind of like that.
Something like that. Yeah. Well, you put a potty mouth word in the first book. You've got the illustration here of like America blowing apart, right?
If you're going to write about what some of the most boring, if you're going to write about things that people sometimes consider incredibly boring, you've got to find a way to first either give it a title that slaps people over the head and says something really wrong is happening here. And then you've got to be engaging. You have to tell stories that connect these problems with democracy to people's real lives. Because this is not a dry, esoteric academic subject. Gerrymandering and structural democracy reform is all about the decisions that are made that affect our daily lives every single day. And the real pleasure of this book in a lot of ways was at a time in which I felt a little bit hopeless. I mean, I had written a book about how democracies die, and I would often go to conferences or give talks or go to bookstores, and I felt like Pigpen in Peanuts. I had the dark cloud over my head, and it was hard to get rid of that. You know, I mean, I was not the Hunter S. Thompson of democracy reform. I was the Pigpen of democracy reform. I was coming in and I was sucking the air out of the room with how bad it was and how serious all the problems were. And the problems are serious, but people were getting to work fixing them. And it was the absolute thrill of a lifetime to be able to go out and ride along with all of these democracy warriors at a time when everybody was a little bit down. Everybody maybe was watching cable news and throwing things at the TV or taking their frustrations out on Twitter. Around the country, people said, that's not what I'm going to do. Regular people rolled up their sleeves and said, I'm going to get to work fixing these big structural problems that other people had said were too stout, were too high, that nobody cared about, that couldn't be done, that were too boring. And then they won.
Yeah. I got to say, you know, the thing that really strikes me, I know that there are people who are distressed about our democracy, but it really strikes me is that there's this tone shift. In your previous book about gerrymandering, right? It was about the depredations of people who would like figure out exactly how to tweak the rules and just find all the angles and distort our democracy. And now, post 2016, maybe I'm just an optimist, but I feel like a lot of people have come alive. People who didn't necessarily know that there was a problem, maybe weren't paying that close attention, and then wake up one morning and say, "Oh my gosh, racism is up front and center. We're talking about authoritarianism as if it's within the normal range of discourse." Like all these things are happening that have become inbounds that many of us thought were just crazy talk, right? It's like this thing that snuck up on us, and so when I read Unrigged, I read a story of basically people who've kind of woken up, which is interesting.
I think that's right. You know, I think that Americans woke up on November 9th, 2016, and they lived in a deeply divided country, an almost exactly divided country, right? And yet all of the political power was sitting on one side. And I don't think people fully understood how that could happen or why that could happen. And there were these structural reasons why gerrymandering, not the only one, but a big piece of it. And they began this process of unrigging their own democracy. They,
locally,
Katie Fahey in Michigan, I mean, literally is the day, it's November 10th. It's 2 days after this election. Katie Fahey gets up in Michigan and posts on Facebook, I want to do something about gerrymandering in Michigan. Join me, like me here if you want to get involved. It was that quick.
But a few years earlier, she had also made a Facebook posting, if I remember correctly. There was no response or very little response. So something's changed. But she had her heart in the right place. She understood there was a problem. And then she made it's sort of a matched control experiment where, she posts it once, crickets. Then post 2016, she posted again and right? Like eruption.
I sold the first book with the title of Gerrymandered Nation. And my publisher said, yeah, you can't give the most boring topic in the world, the most boring name in the world.
Right.
And we ended up with Ratfucked. But people now know what gerrymandering is.
Right.
My book could have a different name if it came out today.
But the thing is, you are a major force in putting this on the map, I mean, as it were. Right, getting it in front of people, like telling the stories of gerrymandering. Hey, I want to talk about some of these stories here in Unrigged because, like you say, it's about more than gerrymandering. It's more than redistricting. It's about the rules of democracy and about people who have changed those rules locally. And I wonder if we could just do a few of the stories. I just want to, and in these days in our democracy, we're discovering that partisanship and race and gaming the rules all have come together into this like funny, like triple spiral of things that are happening. And I wanted to just drill into a couple of the stories and talk about them a little bit. And one of the stories in your book where they come together is the story of Desmond Meade, and in Florida, and restoration of rights. So for people who have served their time. And I wonder if you could just talk about Mr. Meade and talk about what you discovered when you talked with him, and what happened in Florida.
What happened in Florida is, I think, one of the most amazing democracy stories of our time. You had the largest expansion of voting rights in Florida in 2018 that we've seen since the introduction of the Voting Rights Act. And they essentially managed to undo a vestige of the Jim Crow South. If you had a felony conviction in Florida, you lost your voting rights, essentially permanently. There was a really convoluted process you could go through involving getting a pardon from a governor's board that barely ever met, and you would have to wait 14, 16, 18 years usually. So that didn't happen. And this affected 1.7 million people in the state of Florida. So it's 10% of the adult population. It's 20% of the African-American population in Florida. This is a huge, huge issue. And especially in a state in which, in 2000, elections are decided by 550
Hundreds of votes, right?
So imagine what an additional 1.7 million people on the voting rolls might mean. And this goes back to literally the days after the Civil War. The Southern states, if they wanted to come back into the Union, they had to ratify the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution as a precondition, which are essentially your equal protection and one person, one vote amendments, citizenship for everybody, voting rights, and
equal protection under the law.
Exactly. And these states like Florida didn't want to do that because Florida actually would have had a Black majority had they simply gone along with this. So what they did was they accepted it, and then they wrote all of these new preconditions into their state constitution immediately thereafter. They essentially said, you cannot vote if you have a felony. And then they redefined what a felony means, and they essentially made it into anything you might do if you were a poor Black person in Florida, became a felony, and you lost your voting rights. And it stayed that way all the way until 2018.
I looked up some of these things. So a felony in Florida these days includes selling beer to a minor. It includes getting into a fist fight. It includes, drug possession charges like marijuana. But, selling beer if you sell beer to a 20-year-old and you get caught, that's it. No right to vote for the rest of your life. It's just astounding.
I met people in the course of writing this book who would get arrested at 17 for a minor drug possession charge, and they would lose their voting rights forever before they had even used them. That's what this would do. And they were getting trapped in a vestige of the Jim Crow South that I think most people either didn't know existed or thought was long gone. And so Desmond is a former felon himself. He'd been through a weapons charge and drug possession and deep depression. He gets out of prison. He's still homeless, and he slowly cleans up his life. He enters rehab. He goes to college. He goes to law school. But no matter what he does, he can't get his right to vote back. So he becomes the executive director of something called the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, and they begin the process of building this amazing moral coalition, Black and white and conservatives and liberals and tattooed Trump-loving deplorables and radical criminal justice reformers on the other hand. They're funded by both the ACLU and an arm of the Koch brothers, and right. They frame this as an issue of fairness, of second chances, that everybody, that a civic voice is too important to have wiped away. And once you've paid your dues and done the time, you ought to get that right to vote back. And in November of 2018, 64% of their fellow Floridians agreed with them. That's a staggering number, right? 64% on a voting rights issue.
It's hard to get 64% of people to agree on anything on the ballot. So they did it, although I will say that there's still a struggle, right? Because the Florida legislature has still attempted to add more rules to make it hard to vote. For instance, saying, okay, fine, you're out of prison and you served your time, but you still owe some fees here. And now it's being fought out in court, right? So it's turned into a court battle, which might go the right way, but it's in the middle of the 11th Circuit Court. Not clear how that's going to go. And so now there's other, and it's turned into something that's like a poll tax again. So it's still being fought out now.
None of these fights are ever over. If it was easy to fix any of these voting questions, we would have fixed this with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, right? These things are permanent battles. Power concedes nothing without a demand, and sometimes even when the demand is made and amplified by 64% of the state, it still concedes nothing. That's
right. So the fundamental issue is that people vote and vote and vote, nothing happens, and there have to be ways for people to take that power back. And it's impressive in states that have the initiative process, which is about half of states, then people like Desmond Meade can lead the way. I'm really impressed with the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, because I will say, I just want to make sure their name gets lifted up, because they are very important now. I think I hope that there's a wave of effort to register voters down there, because there are, the Florida legislature is in the balance. I think getting back to gerrymandering, the only defense against gerrymandering in Florida is probably to have divided control of government. And one could imagine that the FRRC could be registering voters in key districts and just say, here's the 15 closest districts in Florida. Why don't we just register every man and woman who served their time, get them all on the voter rolls, and have voters have as big a voice as possible to link citizens to their government. And so I see that, I think that what Meade has done, I would love to meet him someday, what Meade has done has really, I think, opened the door for a better democracy in Florida. So I want to maybe talk about just a few more things. Like, there's a road trip that you made. Where was it? Was it like Montana or New Mexico? Like you write about like riding in some like broke down car someplace.
Oh, I'm in Idaho. I'm in Utah. There's stories from North Dakota. I'm all over the place in this book.
So in several of those states, is that the Medicaid expansion? Is that what it was about?
I was out in Idaho on Medicaid expansion.
That's a deep red state, and yet people wanted the Medicaid expansion.
It's a deep red state. 6 years in a row, the legislature said, no, we're not going to expand Medicaid, even though folks are paying their money. It goes to Washington, doesn't come back. And you had a handful of young people in Idaho who had gotten involved in a school levy, a battle in their hometown. They recognized that they had some skills that might help organize. And they got involved, and they won the school levy fight. They said, what else can we do? They decided they were going to work on Medicaid expansion. There's 70,000 people in Idaho who kind of fell into the gap between the state exchange and the national Obamacare program. And they just went to work. They bought an old RV for like $1,400. They painted it a crazy color green, and they just started barnstorming the state, collecting signatures, talking to people, persuading their neighbors. And it's a remarkable story. They too win with upwards of 60% of the vote in Idaho. And they did it by going out and persuading people the old-fashioned way. It's such an amazing story of what we seem so polarized, right? All the talk in this country is of how polarized we are, how broken we are, how you can't even share Thanksgiving dinner with uncles and aunts of another party. They prove that when you go out and do the work of organizing and persuading, you can win in Idaho.
But isn't that, it feels to me like part of that is that culturally we've made partisanship and our affiliations to our parties like affiliation with a sports team as opposed to issues. And so what these young people did is they made it about the issue, and they made it about the substance of how people's lives could be improved. And they had a mechanism for doing that, right? So making it be about the issues creates an opening for passing laws, for approaching legislators. And it feels like, again, like by whatever means necessary, whatever state it might be, it can be local city council elections, it can be ballot initiatives, it can be running for office. All this stuff that I had once thought of as being primarily for goals that were not populist at all, it appears that there are some pretty populist goals that are supported, like you say, by 60% or up of the population that can be achieved by taking the local route. I'll tell you that, I know we're talking about your book tonight, but over at election.princeton.edu at the Princeton Election Consortium, we are developing information resources to help people identify exactly how they can make a difference locally in all those ways. And we're looking for ways for people to make a difference in state legislative races and ballot initiatives. And we're basically creating a resource to help people take the local route and find their inner Federalist.
It's so important. I mean, when you look at the redistricting that happened, of course, after, in 2010, 2011, that's the subject of RAT-EFT. It all starts with state legislatures. Republicans win 117 key state legislative races in 16 states, and that gives them the power to draw all of these district lines in state legislatures and in Congress that have endured for the last decade and have locked in this enduring form of minority rule. Local. That is where it starts. It's the only way to begin the process of undoing that triple knot of unfairness that you talked about that our democracy has been tied up into.
Right. But the thing is, this year, it seems like there's lots of opportunities now that the pendulum has swung back a bit. I mean, there's this magical moment of single party rule that one party took advantage of back in 2010. Yes. But I'm looking at the map and I see, I don't know, one legislative seat in Kansas could break single party rule and flip it back to bipartisanship in Kansas. One state legislative seat. The Texas state legislature, my team has been doing analytics and we are shocked to discover that actually the Texas legislature is weirdly more up for grabs than one might imagine. For instance, Beto O'Rourke won a majority of state legislative districts. And so one can imagine that local route might actually be a route for people to break the cycle of feedback that keeps the powerful in power.
Yes. I mean, Pennsylvania in 2010, that was one seat. Democrats had a 102-101 advantage in the state legislature in Pennsylvania. Republicans went in, flipped a handful of seats, rewired the state for a decade. Right. And I have a chapter in the book that chronicles a lot of the new organizations that have sprung up in the wake of this that are attempting to drive resources and data analytics and passion and knowledge down ballot to sort of yes.
Let's talk about some of those nerds. Like let's talk about a certain piano teacher, Amanda Holt. Okay, I actually met her the other day, as we always meet people these days through Zoom or teleconference. So I didn't actually meet her, but anyway, I looked at her like the way I'm looking at you. And Mandy, if I understand correctly, was a piano teacher and she got mad about redistricting. Can you just talk about Mandy just a little bit?
She and her neighbors on the same street were in different districts and they didn't understand why. It didn't make any sense to them because, as John Oliver says, everything about gerrymandering is dumb and makes no sense. And she got to work essentially trying to imagine what different maps would look like. And I mean, what she shows is that citizens can do this work of mapping. The politicians want you to think that this is some highly technical skill that can only be handled by, trained partisan politicians, ideally locked behind closed doors in a basement bunker someplace. But the truth is that this is not that complicated.
It is technical if you want to get an advantage that's unfair. I would say that it's kind of like lying is harder than telling the truth because with lying you have to keep your story straight. Yeah. But truthful, honest redistricting that gives everyone a voice is actually not that hard because the game is you get everybody at the table and okay, fine, there's a lot of arguing, but the interests are represented. So there's something about honest districting that's not hard. So Mandy, anyway, so there she is.
And I mean, Pennsylvania, she helps spark a redistricting revolution in Pennsylvania. She brings attention to the problem in a way that otherwise people would not have thought about it at all. And she catches the imagination of reformers and politicians and the media. She's named the Citizen of the Year by one of the local newspapers, and it sparks lawsuits. Public interest lawyers get interested, and they win an early lawsuit in Pennsylvania, and then a few years later they would win another lawsuit that essentially overturned the entire congressional map there, a map that had given Republicans the 71% of the seats, even when they won fewer than 50% of the votes. And it got replaced overnight with a map that ensures a closely divided state has a 9-9 map.
Right, 9-9 map, and where it was 13-5, and also more competitive races, right? And so all of this made possible.
It was a locked-in, uncompetitive 13-5.
Yeah, so not just partisan advantage, but just that legislators on either side of the aisle don't have to work for the re-election. And Mandy told me that she did all that work back in 2011 or whenever it was, with Excel spreadsheets and paper maps. You know, she was sitting there with like her census block. I mean, it's a nerdy activity. So she's sitting there with her census block lists and her precinct lists, and she's doing it in Excel. And I was really trying to sell her on the fact that there is much better software now, which of course she knows. There's a thing called Dave's Redistricting app, not made by you, but if you look up Dave's Redistricting app, they're about to release their new version of it. And it's way user-friendly. It's easy to draw districts. It gives you lots of metrics. It tells you whether you've taken a racial minority and packed them tight into a few districts. It tells you about whether the parties are treated similarly. It tells you whether the districts are too funny shaped. So it actually incorporates party, race, and all these metrics. And it looks, I think that the playing field has really been leveled, so that Mandy Holt is a trailblazer. But it feels like there's an opportunity for many more people to get involved, whether it be Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Virginia, right? Lots of places.
I think that is the lesson of Mandy Holt. It's the lesson of Katie Fahey. It's that when one person stands up, and there are a lot of others who stand up alongside you, and change happens.
Are there, in this book, there's so many little stories. Are there favorite stories that come to mind when you think about people standing up and doing things, whether it be redistricting or any topic? Is there something that you think we should maybe get into a little bit?
I would like to talk about the Native American chapter a little bit, because
North Dakota.
North Dakota and also Utah, because we're in a moment right now in which the Navajo Nation has seen a kind of COVID spike that is absolutely horrifying, and it's one of the very worst outbreaks in the nation. And I went out and spent a lot of time there in southern Utah, and San Juan County is the size of New Jersey, and it's majority Navajo, but it's very, very close. There are 3 small towns up at the very northern border that are largely white towns. And ever since Brigham Young came and settled that part of the state back, you're going back to the 1870s, 1880s. Even though it's been majority Navajo, whites have controlled the politics there. And in 1980, in the 1980s, there were lawsuits over the county commission because it was set up in such a way that there was no way that the Navajo could possibly gain a voice in county politics. And so what they did was they set up an at-large system. So it was slightly more fair, but because more white people turned out to vote all the time, they would win all of the at-large seats. So it actually changed nothing. And then they did not redistrict like they were supposed to in 1990. They did not redistrict like they were supposed to in 2000. And they did not redistrict like they were supposed to in 2010. They ignored court orders. They said, well, there's this consent decree in place from the 1980s, so this is how it has to stay. They did not redistrict for 30 years. It's like something. It's like something
that's even possible.
The early part of this century, before the Supreme Court issued their key rulings in the 1960s on redistricting, and finally, lawyers in Navajo continued this fight for decades until a judge finally forced a district system, and they forced a fair map. And in 2018, for the first time, Navajo won a majority on the San Juan County Commission. And this is an amazing story because for years, all of the resources, the money in this area went to these 3 little white towns up at the top. And the schools in Navajo Nation were just atrocious, the roads. And now, the healthcare, there's a reason why, COVID is spreading. And it has to do with the way that politics has been structured there, the way politics was structured there intentionally. And this is not some story, out of the 1830s or the 1850s or kind of old America. This is a story out of what we were doing to Native Americans in this country during this decade. And these stories continue and they go on. In the story in North Dakota, I think is another amazing one, because what happens, North Dakota actually doesn't even require you to register to vote. Everybody knows.
Right, you just show up and go vote.
You show up and vote.
Which sounds good.
Yeah, sounds great, right? And in 2013, after Native Americans, the largest minority group in the state, help elect Heidi Heitkamp, a Democrat, to the U.S. Senate, you begin seeing these voter ID bills cropping up. And these voter ID bills in North Dakota all had something in common. They mandated a street address, which is the one thing that they knew did not exist on all of this tribal land. So it was essentially a voter ID that served as a voter suppression effort, directly requiring the one thing natives did not have. And there's a court battle that goes on for about 5 years. Courts knock it down. The legislature comes back and toughens it and tightens it up. And in the fall of 2018, they find a judge who is willing to allow it to stay in place. And the Navajo do this. The tribes in North Dakota embark on this amazing effort to save their right to vote. They partner with universities and mapping experts. Folks come in and they use planes and GIS mapping system, and they figure out coordinates to give street addresses to all of these homes.
GIS is a computer standard for drawing maps.
They make IDs. They burn out ID machines. They make so many IDs. And a turnout in the tribal land in 2018, it soars 40, 50, 60, 70% in some cases. And in one of the most amazing election results we don't talk about out of that year, the very first Native American woman is elected to North Dakota State Legislature, and the man that she defeats is the guy who proposed the original voter ID bill back in 2013. It's just this beautiful, a full picture story.
So one thing that strikes me there is that in this battle over the individual right to vote, so we were doing line drawing, now we're kind of going back in time to protecting the individual right to vote. One thing that strikes me is that as these infringements on the individual right to vote come to the fore, it seems to me that citizens will often get angry and get riled up and respond to the threat to their right to vote in the way you just described in native lands in North Dakota. Another thing like that happened this year, I think in Wisconsin, where the state Supreme Court said, no, Governor Evers cannot delay the election, the primary election, you got to have it. And if you look at the numbers compared with other primary elections where there was just one contested primary, turnout was way up. And one of the conservative members of the state Supreme Court was turned out of office and replaced by a liberal. So everybody knows, like, people in state Supreme Court seats in Wisconsin are by election, and record turnout or high turnout. And it was, I think, as far as I can tell, I think people were pretty agitated about having their right to vote threatened by some fools who don't want to protect public health. And so I do get the idea that if citizens get mad enough that they wake up out of, the torpor that we as a nation have been in.
Look at the folks in Georgia last week who braved 6-7 hour lines, all to protect their right to vote. They were not going to let it be taken away from them.
I mean, the difficulty here is that, of course, it requires citizen energy, and then it requires the right kinds of expertise, whether it be lawyers or GIS nerds or mathematicians. And so it's like this people and nerd partnership to make it all come together. So I wanted to talk about some of the nerds who, it's close to my heart, who've played a role here. I'm trying to remember. Let's see. So you've got Moon Duchin, and I think you have Wesley Pegden in your book. These are mathematicians who've gotten into the mix. So you've met a number of them by now, right?
Yeah, I have. They have a really difficult job trying to explain their genius level mathematics to somebody who barely figured out the first days of calculus, and that was about as far as I could possibly go. And these guys are trying to explain their amazing, complicated theorems to me. It's like, slow it down. I'm a journalist, but they have done amazing work. And I think what is so important here is that the very technology that has been used against us can be used to see through what has been done and to protect a democracy. So what Wes did in Pennsylvania is he was the key expert witness who showed that the maps that the Pennsylvania legislature had drawn were so infected with partisan bias that as soon as you began making any small, tiny changes to them, and he would just sort of, rub out one line and move it over there, and immediately the maps became less biased. And what he showed is just how carefully constructed they were. And after, and there's a number of mathematicians and computer scientists who have done really brilliant work on this, and that courts have looked to as being very credible, because they are showing essentially massive universes of possible neutral maps, and then you compare the map that the politicians choose, and when you plot that, it's almost always just this insane wild outlier in the 99.9 percentile.
Right. It's like a turtle on top of a fence post, and that the turtle didn't get up there by itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I wish I had that line in the book. That's good.
I think I ripped that off of some law article that I read. I read a lot of law articles these days, out of my domain, but it seems to be important. These tools, though, I think that it's really important, in my view, to emphasize this teamwork between math nerds and citizens. I mean, like my guys here at Princeton are developing tools like openprecincts.org to make sure that there's good data that everyone has to work with. We have representable.org, which allows citizens to draw their community of interest, like to actually take a map and say, okay, this is where we live, this is who we are. You cannot neglect the Chaldean Americans of Dearborn, and here's who we are, and then they upload it. And so I think tools like representable.org, I hope, will even boost this even further.
When you give citizens the tools, it makes all the difference. When politicians are the only ones who have the tools, they get away with everything.
Hey, I wanted to, there's a question that I spied on, because I really wanted to really beat on this question of local action. Somebody in the Q&A has asked about gerrymandering in Texas. We've already touched on a little bit, but some of these things can be addressed by federal law and federal judges, and some not. So I really want to get into the issue of what to do in different states. And the question is somebody from Texas, and that person wants to know what's the hope for partisan gerrymandering in Texas, and is there a possibility of a Supreme Court decision reining in political gerrymandering? And of course, I saw this and my hair started curling, but I thought, you know what would Dave say?
Texas Texas is not easy. Texas is going to have a long path back to fairness. To answer the simple part of it, no, there's not a chance of the U.S. Supreme Court. They closed that door
a year ago.
North Carolina case a year ago, Common Cause versus Rucho.
Yeah.
They said that partisan gerrymandering is a non-justiciable political issue. They said it has to be.
They said it was bad. They just said we're not going to do anything about it.
Yeah, they said it's bad and we're not going to do anything about it, and voters can take care of it, leaving out the fact that voters can't take care of it because majorities of voters can't change their legislatures in all of these states. So it was another example of the court kind of sticking its head in the sand.
Right. That's like, you can let yourself out of the cell. The key's over there on the hook outside the cell.
Exactly.
It's ridiculous. I have to say, I got so mad. And Justice Kagan's dissent on that was fire. It was just, she was so mad about that. But I think the key though here is that every state has its own approach. And I think the answer to this guy's question is that in Texas, probably what's needed is to just take power back by going to half a dozen districts and changing who controls the legislature, which is of course hard because of gerrymandering, but not impossible. And so it feels to me like there are ways to do it.
It's a multi-step problem in Texas.
Right.
In some states, it's as simple as if what you don't want in a state is one party to have all of the levers of power. If you think of redistricting as seats at the table, in most states, it's the state legislature, the House, the Senate, and the governor who have seats at the table. When it's a trifecta and one party has it, they can have dinner in the basement and lock the door and draw whatever map they want. So if Democrats are able to take back the state house in Texas, they win a seat at the table. Then the problem becomes, how do you adjudicate a dispute if the sides can't come together on an agreement? And the problem in Texas is that if you can't come to an agreement, it goes to this tie-breaking panel, this obscure tie-breaking panel that's appointed by the governor that hasn't actually been used for anything in decades, but the governor is already stacked with all of his buddies. Yeah,
I think one of them is the land commissioner, who's George P. Bush. There's a big clue there about what party he's a member of. The attorney general. Yeah.
Texas.
So Texas has issues.
But other states, a seat at the table creates change.
Yeah, I over at gerrymander.princeton.edu, we list all those. Hey, Dorothea has texted me, and there she is now. I think in our remaining time, I think it would be great to take questions, and I believe that is why Dorothea is here.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, first of all, I just want to say how much I've been enjoying listening to the two of you. There really is, in your conversation and also in reading the book, the sense that I think your language for it was that there are moral coalitions and that there are these efforts that can be quite low tech of persuasion, which are what reminds us of what many of us, I think, hope politics are about, right? Moral coalitions and the work of persuasion. So that's all really great. But yes, there are questions in the queue. And Sam, I'm glad that you already pulled one into the conversation. One here is, I assume, coming from a student, from Wendell Collins, asking what students with coding and data science skills can do to help this cause. And I think this is an interesting one because, of course, on the gerrymandering side, there's so much data mining that goes on, and it's such a high-tech effort. So concretely, what might someone with that skill set do to help?
Okay, if I take this one, Dave?
I was pointing at you. I think that would be perfect.
So, Wendell, there are many things that you can do. I would say that one thing you can do is to start playing with software like Dave's redistricting app and start understanding how to use it to draw districts. You can be in touch with my gerrymandering team. Also, there's a really terrific workshop that Moon Duchin runs at Tufts University and the Radcliffe Center in Boston. And so there are people you can get in touch with. So that's Moon Duchin, D-U-C-H-I-N. But I think really importantly, let's really return to this issue of federalism. Wendell, whatever state you live in, you don't say in your question here, but whatever state you live in, there's a need to build local talent. And I will say that as my team reaches out across the country to Ohio, to North Carolina, to Arkansas, to Michigan, to Virginia, to Colorado, what we want more than anything else is for there to be local talent. And so So what we'd love is for there to be local networks that are like the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. And that's probably going to involve you figuring out who to get in touch with in your state. It might be hard. You could form a club. You could form a gerrymandering club, or an anti-gerrymandering club. Form a fair districts club and get some fellow people with coding and data science skills, create a website, draw some demonstrative maps that show what's fair and not fair. Get in touch with your local organizations. I will say that depending on where you are, there's some great organizations. Common Cause is a great organization that fights for fair districting. Often ethnic group organizations like MALDEF and NAACP. The League of Women Voters has been really in the lead. And despite the name of the League of Women Voters, they are very much at the forefront of saving democracy for women and men. They came into politics at a time when there was a need to promote the interests and civic involvement of women. But the league, so find your local organizations, and I think there's just ways that you can get involved. And I would really encourage you to find ways to help in your home state, because I think there's a lot that you can do wherever you are.
Yeah, great. So I hope everyone is taking notes here. There's a question that kind of tacks in a different direction. So not so much what can someone with specialized knowledge do, but more in the relationship between specialized knowledge and the need to convey the essence of a matter. The question here comes, when taking the issue to court, how do we fight the notion of overly academicizing the evidence, especially when someone like Chief Justice Roberts calls the math sociological gobbledygook? So, in the face of anti-intellectualism, or in the face of, how does the specialization that's required perhaps to make a case butt up against the need also to be accessible in explanations and make a case?
First, I think I see Jonathan Service in the list of people who's here, and I believe Jonathan played a really important role in Utah in drawing those maps in San Juan County. So I want to say hello and thank you. The Chief Justice was being willfully play acting his own ignorance there. The Chief Justice has got enough advanced degrees from a different Ivy League institution, but still a pretty good one, that he's able to understand what is essentially a simple seat vote ratio. And by calling it sociological gobbledygook, he was trying to confuse something that is actually not that confusing. And that an array of federal judges appointed by presidents of both parties in cases out of Ohio, North Carolina, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Maryland had all agreed that there was a clear need for the federal courts to be involved here, and that the mathematics of this were relatively clear and simple and had been developed in such a way that a clear and manageable standard was able to be presented. And if you look at the Pennsylvania trial, if you look at the North Carolina trial and the exhibits that these lawyers have put on, they were very skilled at sort of taking the complicated math and showing the turtle on the fence. So you could see that there were 3 billion potential maps that Munduchin could draw, or that Wes Pegman could imagine. And the one that was chosen was more radical than all 3 billion of them. Even an old federal judge can understand that.
Yeah, I think judges are not afraid of technical evidence. They have to do that all the time. I think it's more an issue. The way I would interpret this question is that it is important to think about the audience. And if you're talking to a court, expert evidence shows up in court. You just have to go there. And I'm sorry, this overly academicizing this thing, I totally disagree. I just don't think that's a problem. Like, no more than it's a problem to have a doctor show up in court. But it is important to think about who the audience is. Right. If you're talking to voters, what you say is, Flint doesn't have clean water. Why doesn't Flint have clean water? It is because that state is gerrymandered and there's no one who's going to respond to you. And then you just, boom, you're done. And so I think there's just things that you can say to people, and you have to judge your audience and figure out what you say to each group. And if it's regular people, you say, you vote, nothing happens. Well, guess what? We're going to change that. Right?
Did he put you up to saying Flint?
What's that?
Did Katie Fahey just put you up to saying Flint?
Is there a problem with saying Flint? Because there's a water issue there, dude.
I know. Katie and I often do panels together, and we sometimes have a drinking game in which if someone says Flint or the other person says census.
All right. Well, I've got water, and I've got clean water.
All I have is seltzer, but I thought for a second that was.
No, it's not a bet. Katie and I do not have a bet on this one.
So you guys, it does seem like there's still more interest in the audience to talk more about the effectiveness of mathematical tools. There seems to be, I think this is a different case, Rucho versus Common Cause. Is that a different case? Yeah, where the court again turned away from mathematical tests. And so the particular question here from David is how one can make sure that the mathematical and technological tools are effective, particularly at local levels. Go ahead.
All of the local courts, all of the lower courts believed in the math and they understood the math. If you go and you look at the ruling out of North Carolina, the original ruling before the case went to the Supreme Court, it is the clearest explanation of these of multiple mathematical processes, all of which pointed in the same direction. And the court was like, we know how to weigh evidence. This is what we do. People bring us evidence, we weigh it, and we make a decision. And it was so clear to this lower court. And that decision, essentially, you can almost read it as the judges on that lower federal panel begging the Supreme Court and begging the Chief Justice to really look at this, that it's not gobbledygook. Because that decision came down a couple of months after Roberts talks about gobbledygook in the Wisconsin case, which was argued in October of 2008. Excuse me if my years are messed up, but it's argued in October of 2017, and the decision in the North Carolina case comes down in December. And the judge is just like, it's not gobbledygook. Let me explain it to you. It's clear as day. I have some reporting in the new book from inside the court that suggests that Roberts intentionally tried to frame this as complicated and confusing because he knew that the swing vote was 81-year-old Anthony Kennedy. And he tried to position this in such a way that everybody was aiming their arguments at Kennedy on both sides. And Roberts believed that if he complicated the math.
I think Kennedy is somebody who's, to be blunt about it, is like overwhelmed, can be brought to heel by somebody who makes him feel like he's not as smart as they are.
Yes.
And I think that's the vibe that and Roberts just read him. And I mean, he's being blunt here. Yeah. But I think, I think another answer though, Dave, is that, again, to take it to the state level and forget about trying to persuade, like you think that the Supreme Court is like daddy who's like smart and strong and going to take care of you and listen to your problems. That is not the Supreme Court anymore. Okay. Supreme Court is now like stepdad who like wants to like steal your money and buy beer. Okay. So you got to go to the state courts. And if you want a court that's going to listen to these arguments, it's not a question of coming up with a better argument. Like I thought this for years. No, like Pennsylvania will listen to you. North Carolina will listen to you for a couple of years. Missouri will listen to you. If you work your butt off and you work and get judges elected who might listen, then in a couple of years, Wisconsin will listen to you. Okay, those are states who are going to listen to you. Do not bring a case in Florida. Don't bring a case in Georgia. Just don't do it in Ohio. Just don't. In those states, you got to do something else. That's, I think, that's, I mean, pardon me saying it in terms of power, but it's about power.
If you had a Supreme Court that allowed you to take care of this in every state at once, instead you're now going to have to wage 50 different battles on behalf of sort of these basic voting rights. And there are some states where it's not going to be possible. So if you live, I worry that we are creating these democracy deserts in many parts of the country, in which, if you live in Georgia, if you live in Florida, if you live in Texas, let alone Mississippi, it becomes harder to vote based on where you live. And there are going to be different barriers put in front of you in coastal America than there are in red state America.
But you got to find the route that works. And
got to find the route.
Federal court, like, just keep off of the federal court. That's just,
court is not going to be a route.
Federal court wants a 6-pack,
yeah.
and you got a piggy bank. That's federal court. Okay.
In Pennsylvania, you needed more than a 6-pack and a nickel. It took $15 million for Democrats to come into Pennsylvania in 2015 and flip the state Supreme Court to make it possible to get that ruling in 2018. So I completely agree with you that you've got to find the route where it exists, but that simply means that we're going to be playing whack-a-mole and driving up the cost of elections in places all around the country.
It's work, but your book, we got to do this now. This book describes the work that citizens are doing, and it's to put this up here, right? That's right. Oh yeah, 4 of yours, Dave. So if you email orders.labyrinth@gmail.com, orders.labyrinth@gmail.com, or you call 609-497-1600. That's 609-497-1600. Do it during business hours.
Yes.
Operators are standing by and will sell you this book.
Sam, that is so great of you to have plugged that information again. And it's true, we're now at the hour. I really think that the two of you have a very unified voice in pointing in the direction of local engagement as the upshot of we have to begin in our own backyards. It does seem to be true, but we don't only have to begin there, but it's also possible to begin there. So that's been really great to listen in on. So my job now is just to thank the two of you again. Yes. To invite you to come tune back into other events. I want to flag for you one that's coming up. It's another co-sponsorship between the library and Labyrinth, and that's a conversation with Julian Zelizer, who will be talking with Sean Wilentz about his important new book on Newt Gingrich and on the rise of the Republican Party as we now know it. So that might be another good follow-up.
Burning down the house.
Burning Down the House is what it's called. That's on July 7th. So again, you can sign up for our newsletters at labyrinthbooks.com or for the Public Library's newsletter. And I also want to tell you guys that we will, someone is already burning down the house.
It's just seltzer.
There you go. I do want you to know that we are that Labyrinth is reopening on July 8th. We're going to take it really cautiously, and we are hard at work to redo the store so that everyone can be confident that their health is protected. But we're very excited to be moving quickly towards that date where we can see you again at the store. And when you guys have your next books out, we will welcome you in our actual space. In the meantime, there's lots to do, and here are some incredibly inspiring examples of what we all can and need to do. So with that, I wish you all a really good night. Thank you again.
Thank you, Labyrinth. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, take care. Good night.
Thank you, Dorothea. Thank you, Dave.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.